Good evening, everybody. This is Patrick from the Poison Pen Bookstore, and we're here with another virtual event. And tonight we have Nancy Goldstone. She's going to be discussing her brand new book, In the Shadow of the Empress. Very beautiful cover design, by the way. And I'll be monitoring the comments field. So if you have questions for Nancy, don't be shy as they occur to you throughout the hour. Go ahead and type them in the comments field, and Barbara will summon me back, and I'll be happy to ask any questions you might have. Barbara, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you very much. It's not that I have magical powers. It's just that we have this routine down. It makes me feel a little bit like Maria Theresa, Nancy. In any case, I'm really delighted. Nancy and her husband, Lawrence, are really distinguished authors of many kinds of books. And if I remember right, didn't you guys write some books for bibliophiles way back?
Oh, yes. We're very big book people, used in rare books. And yes, we did a series on them. That's how we got into it. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's where we first got acquainted. In any case, I wanted to talk to Nancy about this book because, like Nancy, I'm really interested in Maria Theresa. And I'm especially more interested on my most recent trip to Vienna. We stayed in a wonderful hotel opposite the Opera House, but it gave us a chance to really explore the Habsburg and the Albertina, which we will get to in connection with one of her daughters. I have to say, Nancy, that while I love the Albertina, and I spent 2 or 3 hours there, I didn't really understand the background of it. So your book opened up a whole new window to me about the collection. Right, so we'll talk about that as well. And then we have a couple of interesting insights to offer you about Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette, which I thought at first was going to be the least interesting part of this book for me because I knew a lot about them. But it turned out that Nancy has some very interesting new material or new perspectives anyway to offer about that. So
which I am ready to talk about.
Of course you are. Yay. But let's talk first about Maria Theresa, because she really is a fascinating character. What drew you to her?
Who would not want to write about Maria Theresa? I've known I want to write about Maria Theresa for years, but I have learned that the most important thing to do is to come up through the centuries so that you really understand the century that you're in, what came before. It matters so much. And people who just kind of drop into a century, it's very hard to figure out what actually is going on. So I did a number of books. I actually started in the 13th century. I went from the 13th to the 14th to the 15th to the 16th to the 17th. And Maria Theresa, of course, is in the 18th century. And I had heard her story before, but boy, am I glad I waited, because I saw the field much better as a result of that. But what's so wonderful about Maria Theresa is that she was 23 years old, pregnant, untrained, when her father suddenly died, and she inherited the entire Habsburg Empire. She's the first woman ever to do this. And it was a huge amount of territory. It was Austria, Hungary, Bohemia, which is like Czechoslovakia, Czech Republic, and Prague, parts, and she oversaw the Austrian Netherlands, which is Belgium and Flanders. She oversaw, as empress, she would oversee all of Germany, and she had territory in Italy. It's a huge amount of territory, many different kinds of subjects. And no sooner does she inherit this property, then she is attacked on all sides by almost every other European power, all at the same time, on the grounds that a woman would be too weak to rule or to protect her subjects, and they could just waltz in there and take over her property and divvy it up amongst themselves. And boy, did she rose to the occasion, and that turned out to be a really bad idea for some of them. And so I loved her because she just really stopped everything. She really rose to the occasion, and sometimes by sheer will held everything together and fought back. And she ended up ruling for 4 decades, during which time she has 16 children in 20 years. All while she's ruling at the same time. She was just terrific. I mean, there were things wrong with her. I'm not saying she was a perfect ruler or anything, but from my point of view, she was really held together the Habsburg Empire and overcame everything that they tossed at her for me. And it was a war fought because a woman had inherited, and she showed them.
Well, that's really true. Of course, to really understand the Holy Roman Empire, you have to go all the way back to 800 and Charlemagne and, move forward. And the Habsburgs, they were an interesting family. If you want to know what they look like, the Velázquez portraits in the Spanish court have a lot to say. They had this kind of, weird jaw.
That after a while.
Yeah, they really did. And that's part of what's happening in the 18th century is that the sort of splinter of the Habsburgs, the Spanish Habsburgs are not the same as the Austrian Habsburgs.
It's all this, well, in the
split
18th
up.
century, they lose it, yeah.
Well, they do. And so it was a big patchwork. And in fact, the whole remainder of the empire didn't really come to an end until the end of the First World War, when the Emperor Franz died and there was an heir. But by then, the war had splintered up Russia and, the rest. And it was the death blow to really the Habsburgs and the Austro-Hungarian Empire.
Napoleon took care of them too.
But what's really interesting, I think, when you look at the selected genealogy, which goes on for pages here, at the front of the book, and which is really helpful. A, you get to see the range of countries that we now think of as countries involved. B, you see that the keys to a successful reign are good luck. And the 18th century was not a good luck time for many rulers. There was, the French Revolution, the Holbeck collapse.
Yes.
Longevity would be an essential ingredient for a really successful ruler. And unfortunately, one of the things that really struck me when I read through this, Nancy, was smallpox. I mean, we don't even think of smallpox as a particularly pernicious disease. But I can't imagine how many people, I should have counted them, children particularly, but not all children, died of smallpox as you list in your genealogy. It was awful.
It was horrible. And the thing was that they did have inoculation, but it was with live smallpox. Later, they would get like cowpox, and it would be much safer, but it was risky to have the inoculation, but you had to try it because it just ran through whole families. It was such a virulent disease. It was the COVID of its time, and it just wiped people out. And the thing was that if it didn't kill you, it still marked you. You were disfigured by it, and so it ruined lives that way. It was a terrible disease.
Well, it really was. We also had venereal disease, which the Spanish thoughtfully brought back from when they went to the Americas, because it was a disease endemic to North and South America, not to Europe. So that comes into play as well. But if you look back, Elizabeth I barely survived smallpox and was disfigured thereafter. It was one reason she wore that heavy white maquillage makeup, was to cover up her smallpox scars. And Louis XV of France, Louis XV, died of smallpox, and he was
horribly.
Yeah, it was really, really ugly. There's a wonderful program called Nicolas Le Floch, which is a 10-episode thing that you can watch on MHC TV, and it takes place during the reign of Louis XV and then on to Louis XVI, which we can talk about. And the deathbed scene of Louis XV is really horrific, because of the smallpox. But my point is that while there's a great many infants that Nancy shows died of the disease, and therefore these women who had multiple children didn't get to raise a lot of them, it also, it attacked adults as well. It wasn't just infanticide that, that prevailed. So it was hard to rule for a long time. The other key, of course, to being a successful dynasty is fertility. I mean, you have to have luck, and you have to have, a certain amount of longevity. But the first duty of anyone in a dynasty who's ruling is to produce the next heir, which oftentimes led to further disaster because, remember the Lion in Winter?
Yes,
if people live too long, if they reigned too long, then the people next in line got impatient. But sadly for Maria Theresa, although she didn't live to see it, two of her most able children, Joseph and then Leopold, died younger than they might have. So
Right.
it impacted life for the daughters that you talk about, which are were in the Netherlands, or the Habsburg Netherlands,
Right.
and then Maria Christina, known as Charlotte, I think, who was reigning in Naples. And you're absolutely right. When I read this, Ferdinand, her husband, was like the worst husband ever. How she had that many children with that ghastly man.
I know. Well, she was a trooper. I have to say, she's my Marie Antoinette gets all the airway, Marie Antoinette just takes all the oxygen out of the room. I am embarrassed to admit that, although on some level, of course, I knew that Marie Antoinette came from a large family, that she was Maria Theresa's daughter. I never even thought about her sisters. It never even occurred to me that she had sisters, really. And then she has these two, especially that there were 7 sisters altogether that more or less survived into adulthood. I'm interested in women in power, so I chose to follow the women who were most actually governed, actually had something to do with the way the politics worked out. So I chose one of her elder sisters, which was Maria Christina, Mimi. She's with the Albertina Museum, and she governed Hungary first, and then the Austrian Netherlands. But the sister Maria Carolina, Charlotte, who was closest in age to Marie Antoinette and closest loved Marie Antoinette, she goes down to Naples and marries, and Marie Antoinette went at 14 and married Louis XVI. Maria Carolina goes at 15, and where Marie Antoinette the marriage isn't consummated for, 7 years or whatever. Poor Maria Carolina, she's got to consummate it that night. She's 15, and you're raised in Maria Theresa's household. You might as well have been raised in a nunnery. So she's no experience of the world, knows nothing about men, and she's got to go. And she's thrown into it. She marries this guy. He's just infantile, really. He couldn't care less about ruling. It really, in some ways, it wasn't his fault, because his father and mother went to Spain and became king and queen of Spain, and left him to be king of Naples with just like a minister, and the minister did not want him to grow up and challenge him in any way. So he just kept him entertained and kept him young and didn't educate him so that he would never be a threat. And he's horrible. Boy, her mother sends her down with the best thing about Maria Theresa was she sends all her daughters with these letters telling them how they should live their lives and how they should live their, what they should do with their husbands. And it says, follow your husband around anywhere. I don't care how boring it is, get him used to. And so Maria Carolina, that's what she did. And eventually she just grows into the becoming queen, and she takes over the government because he won't do it. He has no interest whatsoever. And so, he cheats on her all the time. He gives her venereal disease. He's just a jerk. What can I tell you?
Yeah, and sadly, he outlives her, which is really too bad. You'd like to think that he would have died first and given her a little freedom, but didn't work out that way.
No.
It's hard to believe that anybody who grew up with a mother who had 16 pregnancies or even more was so, kind of innocent of the whole process. I mean, Victoria had 9 children, and I don't know whether, it was kind of the same routine, but Maria Theresa was pregnant for, as you point out, for 20 years. So how did her kids not sort of
No, they knew what they were supposed to do, but there's a big difference between knowing intellectually what you are supposed to do and never having even kissed a guy before, or never held hands with a guy before, or never had a guy take his, never had to take your clothes off in front of anyone. None of that happened. Their lives were very regulated, and I think, especially at 15, if you are not ready for it, and she clearly was not ready for it, because she wrote these letters that said, in the beginning, I just wanted to die, basically. And that's how they talk, teenagers. They're sometimes when but she really did not like it and wasn't ready for it. And I have a lot of sympathy for that, because eventually she overcame all that and just ended up living, and ended up really doing a terrific job as queen in Naples.
So marrying for love was not really an option for most of these people, but Maria Theresa was really fortunate in that she fell in love with her husband, and the daughter, Mimi, the one that is who goes to Hungary and then to the Netherlands, was also married for love, which her two sisters, Maria Carolina and Marie Antoinette, obviously did not. So if we go all the way back to Maria Theresa's father, my comment about fertility, Charles didn't have sons. And so there was Maria. And he went through a lot of manipulation to perhaps even prevent her marrying her much loved husband. What was that all about?
Well, so Maria Theresa's father is emperor, and he has this just terrible problem that he only sires two girls, and what a terrible thing it would be to have a girl instead of a boy run something. So he's got to try and she's got to inherit his property, but he's afraid that if she does, exactly what happened would happen, that people would attack her, and he was trying to protect her. So first he figures he should marry her to somebody strong, like the King of Spain or King of Spain's son or something like that. But those things fall through, and one of his advisors had early said to him, well, she should marry this guy Francis of Lorraine, because Lorraine is a very crucial part of the empire. It's right on the border with France, and we need them to be strong against France, because France was at the time, France and Austria were the biggest enemies to each other. And so they were trying to keep France from invading Germany or invading Lorraine or coming through to Austria, because that's what Louis XIV had done. And Louis XIV had always been trying to push out towards Germany, take over expand French territory. So they got this nice guy, Francis of Lorraine. He's only like 14 when he comes for like a trial run when Maria Theresa is 6 and he's 14. And, as to a 6-year-old, a 14-year-old is just like a god. And he was an adorable. Francis is totally adorable. He loves to hunt. He's very good with people. He's very social. As she grows up over time, she just only falls more and more in love with him. But her father has to keep trying. He keeps trying to give away her territory, and he's trying to bribe people to say that they will accept her as a ruler later, or the other powers who might attack her. So it's just a terrible strategy. He spends all of their money, all of the empire's money. He spends, he ruins the army. There's one war after another, and the last war he lost so badly that he had to give up Lorraine. And he makes Maria Theresa's fiance, Francis of Lorraine, sign it away. And that is a really hard thing to do, because Francis of Lorraine was, he was count, that was his family's possession. There was his family's subjects, his mother's still living there, his sisters are still living there, and he had to give it all away in order to marry Maria Theresa. And this was very, very hard for him and for Maria Theresa, and she spent the rest of her life actually trying to make that up to him, trying to give him other territory and trying to make him respected, so that it was because it was such a knife in the heart to him to do that.
Well, it was, and that comes back to my point about sometimes people live too long. I mean, if Charles had just died sooner, he
wasn't that.
At the very end, when Franz Joseph, I mean, he lived way too long. He was the wrong king, to be, or the wrong emperor.
That's the thing about inherited monarchy. You can get a lot of bad ones, and there's no way to remove them legitimately or honorably. People didn't step aside back then. That was dishonorable. The only way to do it is to rise up and get rid of them. And that unfortunately happens often in the 18th century.
Well, it does. I mean, disease also or accident can make a big difference. I mean, if you look at British history, if Arthur hadn't died in Ludlow Castle, we wouldn't have had Henry VIII, which would have been a real blessing. If young Henry hadn't died, on the Thames or whatever it was, we wouldn't have gotten Charles I. That would have been a really good idea. There are so many things that can go wrong with an inherited monarchy, and it can lead to, like the English Wars of the Roses. It can lead to all kinds of bitter wars. And, we're in an age where autocrats are kind of making a comeback, but unless they're dynastic, there's always a mess when they die. I mean, when Stalin died, who was going to take over? When Erdogan goes, which can't be too soon, what's going to happen in Turkey? And, the problem with autocracy is that there's no really great mechanism to keep the government going. And even though recent events in the United States have shown that democracy can really fail at this as well, and I hope that we're going to see our way through, when you did have a monarchy, you were really dependent upon, as I said, the good luck, the longevity, and the fertility of the members of the dynasty. And when it went wrong, or when they quarreled, or whatever, it was terrible on the populace. And then, of course, you wound up with ministers, with courtiers who tried to, move the levers of government, right? Because
yes, they would try to take over.
And I really liked what you wrote about Sir William Hamilton and Emma Hamilton. And, she's a person that I thought I knew a lot about, but you went into her in even more depth. That's a truly remarkable story, what happened to Emma.
Yes, Emma Hamilton, Lady Emma Hamilton, she's I don't know why, how is there not a mini series on her already, right?
Well, there should be. I mean, she ends up as the, mistress of Lord Nelson. But on the way, she, from a 6-year-old orphan in terrible straits through working on the streets and, working in a brothel, and eventually becoming a mistress, and then being handed off to her lovers.
Unbelievable story. Beautiful, beautiful girl. One of the most, she was so pretty that people actually stopped in the street and
right.
looked at her.
Well, you can look at the portraits that Romney painted of her, and yes. I mean, you have one in the book, and she really was absolutely gorgeous. But you know what? If you've got an emptiness behind a pretty face,
that's right.
It only goes so far. So it clearly, she had a really powerful personality in addition. Plus, she must have had incredible survivor instincts.
Well, you could see it. I mean, she came from nothing. She has no money. She has to go out on the streets when she's very young, and she has a series of she does have to go into a brothel. She gets a piece of luck in that a guy buys her out of the brothel, then he gets her pregnant and leaves her, and she has to go to somebody else, and that person agrees to take her in, and she falls in love with this other guy, and he does just the most heinous thing and kind of trades her to his old uncle, and without telling her, and she ends up in Naples with I love that. And also she always has her mother with her as her servant. I love that. Yeah. Well, and she ends up helping to save Maria Carolina and Naples, because they were the ones who were absolutely, Admiral Nelson would not have been able to attack Napoleon in Egypt if they had not gotten him all the supplies that he needed at the right time, so he could just take off after them. And that was a big battle that they won. And that was completely because those two women, Charlotte and Emma Hamilton, arranged it. It was
Maria Theresa
really was something
in the 1760s. What was it, 1765? But her daughters obviously move on towards the end of the century through the French Revolution and Napoleon, who was, a real threat to them. But it was Maria Theresa's job as a ruler to arrange dynastic marriages for her daughters, or for the children that she could manage to make successful marriages for. So you started out liking Maria Theresa, but then you really became interested in these three daughters and their marriages and what happened.
The thing about Maria Theresa, and I really feel that, I think the job really got to her. I mean, she became a different person than she was in the beginning towards the end, because it was just, that woman, she read every paper. She chaired her own council meeting. She took everything to heart. She really, really tried, and it's a huge job. And after her husband died, she like all the fire went out of her. And as she got older, her eldest son, who was going to take over, Joseph, just got them into one problem after another, and she just couldn't say no to him because she didn't want to emasculate him, and he had turned against her because he had his own bitter life kind of going on, and she couldn't bear it. So she kind of let him and this other advisor do what they wanted to do. And so she didn't become, she became someone who was much more, I know she would never have, she agreed to things that she would never have agreed to do when she was younger. Just because she was overburdened. But the daughters, they stayed right to the end. They fought all the way through. They didn't have something like that happen to them. So yes, and the daughters' lives were so. Maria Cristina has an affair with her sister-in-law, but you know, this was something that you don't usually see in when I've been investigating royalty, where there's such an obvious connection between two women and that they are clearly in love with each other. And I thought that was pretty exciting, pretty wonderful that they had that things that we see today happen, you can see happen then too.
Well, there were some instances of kings who were known to be gay.
Frederick the Great was gay.
Yeah,
and
Richard, what was it? Richard II, Richard I of England, I can't remember which, was rumored to be gay. Richard II was rumored to be gay.
There's much more there in the French court.
Edward II is the one I'm thinking of. But anyway, you're right. It was far less, but maybe it was less obvious with women.
Yes, that's what I'm saying. It was, it was hard to document that kind of thing. And
well, yeah, and I don't think that people, women are not as actively, as visible actively as men are when it comes to that kind of thing. Let's talk about your interesting research into Louis XVI, because, you really raised, I thought, a fascinating point in that generally when there has been a revolution, the reigning monarch has made a serious effort to protect his family and his children. After all, the children are the legacy that needs to be most, that he's entrusted with and needs to be the most proactive to keep safe. And Louis XVI didn't do any of that. I mean, you often wonder, well, what was it, that Marie Antoinette and the children didn't make it out of France? It really shouldn't have been that hard, but it was like they just denied reality. So what's your theory there?
Well, I think I went through and when I was writing this book, I did not expect to have anything new to say about Marie Antoinette. I wanted to put Marie Antoinette in there because I wanted to get she's so big and the French Revolution. But the second I started to really look into it, I will say there was something about that story that always bothered me, was that they never got out, because every single book I write, somebody has to leave, and they always try and get the kids and women. Even Charles I, who ended up getting his head cut off, was he got his wife and 4 of his children out. So this was something that used to be, was supposed to happen. But as soon as I started to investigate Louis XVI life, I saw that he was almost certainly autism, was born with autism spectrum disorder. This is clearly documented that this was that from childhood, he didn't look people in the eye. He didn't speak. He had a lot of trouble carrying on even any kind of a conversation. He didn't play with the other children. Instead, he ran up on the roof and chased cats. Later, he shot cats on the roof. He had physical mannerism. He had trouble. He was described as very clumsy and made these funny faces. He had to keep to a rigorous schedule. And when I looked at all of this, I actually went to someone who was a specialist in this. Obviously, I'm not. And I just described all of these symptoms to this doctor who has worked for 20 or 30 years at Yale. And I said, what do you think of this? And she wrote back and she said, he checks every box for autism spectrum disorder. And if the thing that is the reason that no one has seen this before is, first of all, this is most people don't look at Louis XVI's life. And the people who do are usually in Europe, and they don't have as much of a feel for this particular disorder as we have here. And also, Louis XVI, one of his ministers figured out right away that what you do is you write everything down and you communicate to him through writing. And Louis XVI was very intelligent, and you can see from all the written material how intelligent he was, but he couldn't confront, he couldn't communicate really. You couldn't just look at the written reports. You had to look at the observations, what other people said about him. And I was lucky because when Marie Antoinette was sent to live with at the court, it was Louis XV was still king then. Her mother was doing some long distance parenting at that point, and she sent her with kind of a spy and somebody who was going to report, an ambassador who was going to report on her every move. And he also reports on Louis' every move, and you can just see all the way through that this was a situation where that nobody really understood the Dauphin, understood his behavior, but this was the behavior, and it persists all through life. And I've seen this in the 15th century, for example, in France. It seems like, oh, you can't diagnose from so far in the future, right? We would love to bring Louis XVI forward and put him in a doctor's office, and go through all the tests that we would do today, but we can't do that. But you can actually figure this stuff out, because in the 15th century, the King of France, Charles VI, he had these symptoms where every couple of months he would not know who he was. He would think he was somebody named George. They'd have to lock him up in the castle. He'd take off all his clothes and run around screaming, and he didn't know anyone. And now we say that that Charles VI was schizophrenic. And interestingly, because Charles VI was schizophrenic, and there was kind of a vacuum at the power at the top of the monarchy, that's when there was a civil war also in France. So the fact that Louis Louis is there, but he is much more not able to, if you can't read people's behavior and you can't look at them in the eye and you don't know what's coming, you are at a great disadvantage. And he couldn't speak at a time when France, every great orator in the world is in France talking about democracy or the revolution. So he was at a distinct disadvantage.
Well, another giveaway was his apparent complete fascination with clocks.
Yes.
That he was very numbers oriented and so forth. So I think your diagnosis, it seems quite obvious. You think about it. And, on the other hand, if mental illness was not often, or not mental illness, but differences, disease like that. Think about poor George III, who was thought to be mad and who actually had porphyria, for which there was no treatment or no cure.
Right.
So, without modern medicine, we are indeed having to guess. But I agree with you that, you can do a observational thing. So you go on to posit that Marie Antoinette, who ended up having 2 sons, one of whom died young, and 2 daughters, was that it?
Right. Well, one of them died young.
Her children, either 4 or 3 of them anyway, were fathered not by Louis, who barely understood the mechanics of sex and probably didn't want to do it anyway, but by the Swedish Count Axel Fersen, who was, there's a lot of evidence that, he and the Queen were intimate. So do you feel fairly confident that he was the father of the boy who was perceived to be the Dauphin and died during the Revolution?
I'm so glad you asked me that question. We had a lot of pushback on this one, because I want to explain that, when we do history isn't a court of law. There's no presumption of innocence. What we do is we list the evidence, we weigh the evidence, and we come out with, on the side of where there's the most evidence. If the evidence is equal, then you say we can't tell. And if it's a little bit one way, then you say, well, it's possible that it went this way. But when the evidence is like up here and down here, we have to go where the evidence shows us. And what we had here was a situation where Count Axel Fersen is very clearly attracted to Marie Antoinette. We have reports even from the Swedish ambassador who says these two can hardly basically keep their hands off each other. And it's a good thing that Axel Fersen he goes and fights in the American Revolution of all things. So he gets him out of town. He says, what a relief that is. I think, we got away with that. But he comes back in 1783. And from then on, there are records of clandestine meetings. They have this elaborate correspondence, Marie Antoinette and Count Fersen, where they have code names for each other. They're surreptitious. They're going through a trusted confidant for this, who has been sworn to secrecy. Fersen goes so far as to number his letters in case one of them goes astray, so that she doesn't, so that she'll know if something's missing. We have his diary, which is just filled with how much he loves her, and all the times that in code kind of that he went and visited her. But even more than that, we have the head of the Royal Guard, of Louis's Royal Guard, who is reporting that this guy is staying over for days at a time at Petit Trianon, and that she has her ladies in waiting there, but she never sees them. She has them kind of for cover, but they never see her during this period. It's 3 or 4 times a week they're meeting sometimes. And then there's this because Louis, they did have a lot of trouble having children, Louis and Marie Antoinette. And that was because he did not understand how conception worked, how the sex act worked. And her brother-in-law had to came and explain to him very quietly and rationally how it was done. And then they worked on it, and they attributed their first pregnancy to her brother for doing this. And they named the second child, who was born, the boy, while Fersen was away. So it was Louis' son. They named him Louis Joseph. So that was Marie Antoinette's brother's name who did this. So you can see that those two children, whose births were spread out over a period of time, those were Louis's children. The second Fersen comes, she gets pregnant the next month. And that one ends in miscarriage. But then she gives a big party for the Swedish ambassador, for the Swedish king, where Fersen is present. And 9 months to the day after that one, she has her son. And then the next period of time, she has a daughter, which she also clearly thinks that she and Fersen think is Fersen's. And during this time, in addition to all of that, Louis is not, the Count de Mercy said, the Austrian ambassador said it was highly unlikely that Marie Antoinette and Louis would have any more children because their schedules are so different. What's really happening is that the situation is deteriorating, and Louis, because of his disorder, is becoming more and more stress on him, and this is very hard for him. So he spends all his time hunting, and when he comes home from hunting, as much of his time as he can, he just eats and drinks himself basically into a coma, and they have to lug him to bed, and his servants just put him to bed every night. That is not a person who is going to be having sex. And Marie Antoinette is hardly ever even there. So you can see that the weight of the evidence is such that it would be the only thing on the side that these last two children were fathered by Louis XVI is that those two were married. That's the only thing. And they are not having, and they never had sex more than once a week as it was, because Louis had to be on a schedule. You wouldn't just have sex with Louis. You would have to get him prepared for it. He would have to know when it was coming, that kind of thing. So I think the evidence is overwhelming that those two children, the younger children, the daughter died, but the son that died, that was the Dauphin and is called Louis XVII today, that was Fersen's child. Fersen certainly considered it. I think they both considered him to be his. Oh, and I'm getting so much, I can't believe that people don't what's wrong with this? What's wrong with letting her have a love? I mean, it's not like she was sleeping with everybody. This is one guy who she is completely in love with and is having a real marriage with, basically, that he's much more her husband than Louis the 16th.
Well, I love the irony, because Louis the 14th is well known to have needed sex at least 3 times a day. So what a contrast. But what's really going on here in part, though, is that, for a wife to be unfaithful was treason, because, the deal was that the children of the wife, in other words, a legitimate marriage, were going to be the heirs. So the king could have illegitimate children all over the place. I think Charles II, for example, made a terrible error when he did not divorce his sterile wife. I mean, he had bastards all over England.
That guy ended without a dare.
No kidding. He left this awful mess because he did not divorce Catherine of Braganza, who was his Portuguese wife. And I think that he was derelict in his duty as a king, not to have done that. So Marie Antoinette would have been guilty of treason if Louis had wanted to do something about it, but because he was probably relieved that she had a lover.
No, it wasn't. He wasn't relieved at all. In fact, we have a report also, again, from the head of the Royal Guard that says Louis knew, but that he couldn't, and that he was upset.
Yeah.
But that he could not, that she got around what the head of the Royal Guard says is Marie Antoinette got around him. But what actually happened was that Louis cannot confront Louis Louis could not lose her, because she was really his only emotional outlet. He needed her. She was his, the way that he approached the world was through her. It's when everything started to collapse, she had to take over. She would have all the meetings. Then she would go to Louis very quietly and calmly and try and find a way to come up with a policy. But he needed her. This was love to him. And so he was never going to confront her. And that's another reason why people said, well, if she was so obvious, then how come he didn't just punish her? Louis was incapable of punishing her. And I will say that she saved him. I mean, she didn't save him, but she repaid him by staying. She stayed and did her absolute best to protect him. When she stayed when every other aristocrat left, and when the Bastille fell, and they decided who was going to go with the army and who was going to leave, and she stayed. She was staying, and his sister was staying. They were staying to protect him. It wasn't the other way around. Usually the king protects the wife and kids. They were staying to protect him. And you can see this. You can see this when the mob attacks the Tuileries, and they are in it was a mob attack. It was just like January 6th, right? 30,000 enraged Parisians with weapons and axes and pikes break down and rush into the Tuileries. And there's only 200 Royal Guard. It's like the Capitol Police, right? They're totally overwhelmed. So what they do is they decide they're going to separate the king and queen, and everyone's after Marie Antoinette as much as Louis. They're going to separate them and try and protect them that way. And Marie Antoinette wants to go with the king. And they say, no, you have to go with the children. So his sister goes with the king. His sister is 25 years old and has led a completely sheltered life. And he lets her go with him to go and confront this mob. Now, can I say, maybe Louis is in his 35 or 36 at this point. He's been king since he was 20 or 19. He's got family, he's had kids, he's been doing this. Would you take your sister into that? Would you take your 25-year, is that who you really want to confront a mob of screaming men with weapons? Do you want to put her in that situation? Wouldn't you say, you know what, honey, why don't you sit this one out? Go find a nice quiet room in a closet and go sit in there. They're not looking for you. But no, she has to go with him. He needs these women as his support. as his emotional support. That's part, and it's not his fault. It's, this is what the disorder is. You need someone with you. It was just the saddest thing. It's a sad situation. He really wanted to be a good king. They were in the process of trying to tax the nobility when the Bastille fell. He just couldn't get it through. He didn't have those skills. That was it.
He was the wrong king for the wrong moment, just like Nicholas II was the wrong Tsar of Russia and Charles I was the wrong king of England. It's really hard to confront these, angry mobs and forces of change. I mean, we're seeing the terrible shape we are here in the United States, where, we almost had a coup, and where, this big lie continues. And unfortunately, so far anyway, we've held the line, but it's embarrassing to live here in Arizona where this audit, has just been a nightmare. And so imagine that if what you've got is, larger armed insurrections and kind of no real backup to protect people. But you have to say that Maria Theresa's three daughters that you write about really were their mother's daughters, really lived up to their mom, because their lives all fell apart. Marie Antoinette's, we've talked about, fell apart. The older sister, the Austrian Netherlands, that eventually fell apart, and they were brought back to live in Vienna, kind of pensioned off, which is where the Albertina, the museum in Vienna, the art treasures, because that daughter was an artist. And her husband indulged her in that, and they had a wonderful collection. But I thought it was sad, and I'm thinking back, Nancy, to how I went through the Albertina. You're saying that she doesn't really have much credit in it, that the Tina is her, but it's more about Albert. And thinking back, because I didn't know any of this before I went there, I wish I had, because I think I would have paid a lot more attention to the attributions of the art. And it isn't just art. I mean, it's wonderful. It's furniture, it's, beautiful rooms, all kinds of treasures and so forth.
Right.
And, if it's her legacy, it's a shame that isn't more obvious.
That if without her, well, first of all, Albert was never going to ever collect anything because he had no money. She had all the money. And in fact, she was the one who got them started on this. That's how they connected, was through art. And she taught him about art, and they went and traveled together, and they decided to do this kind of collection together. But what really happened was when the French Revolution spread out, I think Americans don't realize this, but it went from France all the way into Belgium, it went into Germany, it went everywhere because of Napoleon. And if she hadn't packed up all their stuff, all their art, and brought it with her when she had to leave, and when she had to flee before the revolution, the revolutionaries, then all that stuff would have been in France, in the Louvre somewhere in crates, because that's what Napoleon would have picked it up and just put it there and taken it.
Yeah, it would have been like the Russians who, got to Germany, and took the whole movie, The Monument Men, is about that. And there's a lot of stuff in St. Petersburg and the Hermitage that, was confiscated by the Russians when they moved. Patton was going this way, the Russians were coming this way, and so forth. And actually, turns out that there was a lot of pillaging by the United States as well. So we just don't know as much about it. But I'm sure you're right that she preserved it. And, she was lucky in that she really loved Albert, and, had a happy marriage and survived. They survived the revolution, and relocated to Vienna, where they were, had an allowance or whatever it was, her money, right, and survive. Her sister, the Queen of Naples, had a much tougher time. And
she had to fight Napoleon.
Yeah, we don't really think of Sicily, as a kingdom. I mean, we think of it today as just part of Italy, but it wasn't. All the way back to the Crusaders, it was strategically important because there was in the middle of the Mediterranean, and You know, and it was a powerful kingdom. And in the end, Napoleon sort of broke up her life, but it was really the British who dealt the coup de grace.
Yes, it's true, because then that's because the Mediterranean was so important, and Britain's interests were so much against the French there, against Napoleon. They turned on her just as she had been in alliance with them, Maria Carolina, and just like her mother had once been in an alliance with England, with Britain, and Britain pursued its own interests and broke those alliances, and betrayed both of them, both the mother and the daughter, which was pretty interesting as a parallel in history. But I have to say that because Maria Carolina, the Kingdom of Naples was the entire southern boot of Italy, everything south of Rome, plus the island of Sicily. So when Napoleon first came, when his armies first came, they went just to Naples. And so she had to flee to Sicily. I have to say, if you have to flee somewhere, Sicily is not a bad, bad place.
True. Very true. No, it was Naples. And, you know, I keep coming back to series on MHC TV because I watch a lot, but there's a wonderful series called The Bastards of Pizza Falcone by the late, I'm trying to remember his name, Maurizio somebody. But anyway, in filming it, it really shows you all this magnificence of Naples, all the buildings that have survived and so forth. And it's wonderful to watch. Pizza Falcone is a police district in Naples, which is why it's called that. And if you go to Sicily, it has an enormous number of Greek ruins because it was Greek before it was Roman.
Everybody wanted Sicily. It was
and
right
even,
in the way.
you know, even in people who are living in kind of poverty and so forth, when you watch this stuff, it's amazing how big their apartments and so forth are. You know, I mean, if you watch British crime, you see people living in these ghastly little, you know, cells in high-rise public housing. And then you go to Naples and you have people roughly in the same income level, but they're living in, you know, these gorgeous
Naples
rooms.
was Miami Beach. Naples was a party town when Maria Carolina lived there. I mean, it was on the Grand Tour, and they had lots of visitors all the time, and they had ice cream when nobody else had it. I mean, it was a great place to be. Everyone loved Naples.
Well, it had a really good climate compared to, let's say, England. But the British were ruthless about, you know, because their empire depended upon their control of the ocean.
That's right.
All the seas. And so they were pretty ruthless about Gibraltar and about, you know, Sicily and Naples and about Malta and certainly Egypt, and, you know, onward through India, Hong Kong, all the rest of it. So they were not a sentimental nation. And Sir William Hamilton and Lady Emma, who we referenced earlier, were very close to Maria Carolina.
Yes,
but,
they were.
But, you know, Sir William was elderly, and eventually when Napoleon was dislodged, Napoleon actually put one of his brothers, right, and his brother's wives on the throne. He put
first his brother, and then when Napoleon had a problem because Napoleon was conquering so many kingdoms, he had to like keep moving his family around because, you know, he took over Naples and put his brother there, and then he took over Spain, so he took his brother from that and put his sister there with his brother-in-law instead. And but what I really love about and there was complete war. Napoleon recognized Maria Carolina as the person who was his antagonist in Italy. Of everyone, he knew that she was the one who was going to fight him the most. And so they hated each other for a long time. And then Napoleon decided that he couldn't get a son out of Josephine, and so, or out of his first wife. So he divorced her, and he married the daughter of the Emperor of Austria, and that was Maria Carolina's granddaughter. So she said, now I I have to be the devil's grandmother, on top of everything else. And he started calling him my dear grandmama.
Well, Napoleon was just as dynastic as the Habsburgs,
And just as social climbing, don't kid yourself. I mean, he loves all that stuff.
he was trying very hard to, it's sort of like the mafia. He was trying to put, or the Sopranos. I mean, he was trying to put members of his family in control of everything that he conquered. And of course, he got greedy, and then he got really stupid and tried to add Russia to the whole thing, but we won't go there.
Overconfident.
Right.
He was never stupid, but he might have been overconfident. He was a very smart. He and Frederick the Great, the 18th and then the 18th and into the 19th century, those were the two great military geniuses. And Napoleon based himself on Frederick the Great. All that moving fast and getting there quick.
He wasn't just a military genius; he was an administrative genius.
Yes, also an administrator.
And like Edward the Lawgiver,
But first, he had to be the military genius.
And Henry II of England. I mean, it takes to be a really successful monarch like Maria Theresa. You really do have to understand the levers of power and how to operate them and how to run a bureaucracy, essentially, because no one person can just govern on his own. And you're right, Napoleon he also apparently survived on 4 hours of sleep a night, so he had all kinds of extra working hours. He's a fascinating character, and he really did blast so much of Europe, some of which never really recovered. But anyway, we don't know as much, I think, in America about the Habsburgs in Central Europe as we know about England and France, Italy, and so forth. And so it's really great to have a book that lets you see.
That's what I tried to do.
The heart of Europe was Habsburg.
I try to provide the context. I don't expect anyone to know who won the War of the Austrian Succession. That's what makes it so great to write about, because if you don't know how the war is going to end, there's a lot of real tension in there. Imagine if you were reading a book about World War II and you did not know if Hitler was going to win or not. Okay, that's the kind of tension that you can get in this kind of book. And it's also, you can live through it with these people. They were real people. They lived larger lives than anything I ever had. And it's exciting, but also you learn it. This is what really happened. You really had wars, but you really had a war because nobody wanted a woman to inherit, and they learned their lesson, and that's great.
For people who like fiction, who think that, they don't want to read historical nonfiction, not true, because you couldn't actually make this stuff up easily. And so really Nancy's book in the end reads like not one, but two novels. And I can also recommend Robert Massey's amazing biography of Catherine the Great, which I thought was an absolutely riveting thriller. I read it while I was traveling, in fact, through this territory. So there have been some remarkable women in history. Too often, all the voices in history we hear are men. But every once in a while, you get somebody like...
There's been plenty of women. It's just now that we are starting, history was not just written by the winners, it was written by men. And it's been written by men for ages. Now more women are coming in now, but this is a brand new phenomenon. When I first started out, women, when I wrote my first book was about 4 queens, was about 4 13th century sisters from Provence. Wow. That was a very difficult book to get published because why would you want to read about 4 women? It was that kind of thing. But in every century I have found women, this is why there are so many mysteries in history, because we leave all the women out. History makes a lot more sense when you put the women back in. And that
it actually does. And, we do have some forensic tools available to us now. For example, the whole Anastasia rumor that one of the Romanov sisters survived the assassination of Nicholas and his family. But, they eventually found bones, and they took DNA from Prince Philip.
Right.
And determined that, in fact, this really was the Romanov family. And if the heart of the young Dauphin is, has a provenance sufficient, they could actually test it and prove your theory.
They could. They tested it against Marie Antoinette's hair, and it was Marie Antoinette's. I think they know. myself. I mean, it was never publicly tested. It might have been private. I don't know. They would have to exhume the bones, I think. I'm not sure they want to do that, to go to that expense to do that.
Well, there's some, some things that probably are better off left to
Right.
rest. I mean,
Right.
I have a novelist friend who raised the whole question of whether Victoria was actually legitimate, or whether her mother, in fact, who did have a lover, whether she was, not, in fact, a Hanoverian, but and they know where the lover is buried, and they could open the tomb and, try to figure it out. But what would be the point
Right.
at this stage?
That one, I wouldn't open it up either. Because you know what? She was Victoria, doesn't matter what her.
Well, and at this point, no, it really does. I mean, and part of the reason that the whole thing comes up is there's no real explanation for how hemophilia, how she was a hemophilia, which is a genetic disease, and nobody had it in the family before. And unfortunately, she passed it on. So the
Right.
question is, where did she get it? But anyway, this has been fascinating. It's really been fun. Patrick, do you want to come back? And do you have any questions of your own you might want to throw in?
No, but absolutely fascinating conversation. Are you struck, Nancy, when you're researching this, by how little human nature really changes?
That's
and how contemporary these stories feel?
yes, and that's what I loved about it, was that everything that we deal with, this is not that long ago. Okay, the 18th century. It feels like, I know to people that live today, it feels like the ancient past, but it's not. And people don't change that much. And I think it's refreshing that we had, gay people and lesbians, and that they reacted to things the way we would react to today. And it's just a question of, we have to be willing to write about stuff as it really is. It doesn't help to gloss over things. It doesn't help to mythologize people or not to look at the truth. This is a period that's very crucial. The 18th century, very crucial to what we are living in now, because the 18th century is going to bleed into the 19th, and then we're here. Frederick the Great, who did everything he did because his father was so abusive to him, because his father did not want his son to be gay. Everything Frederick did, that was his entire motivating force. The War of the Austrian Succession was not about economics, like people say, or trying to get more power. This was of one man showing his father that a gay guy could be as good a king as anybody else. And I think, and from that comes this whole, because they've suppressed this, because my German translator, when she read the book, she said, I never thought about it. We never were told that Frederick was gay. So, from that, where that was suppressed because of Frederick's actions, that's what Kaiser Wilhelm will emulate in World War I, and what Hitler will emulate in World War II. And I suspect that if they'd known what Frederick was really like, maybe they, maybe they might not have, but whatever. But that's something that you really have to think about. That was because that's not what they teach you in school. They're not what they're going to tell you in school. But that was what that war, and that war bleeds into the 7 Years' War, which is us. That's our war, French and Indian War. And that's just a continuation of a woman shouldn't be allowed to rule and a gay guy shouldn't be allowed to be king. That's all. That's it. I think it's fascinating.
It really is. And I think it's great that we can write about it and read about it. It hasn't been, the gay revolution is so recent. I mean, you go back and look at, the computer guy in England, I can see Derek Jacobi biting into the apple, but, I mean, it was 1956 or something, and he was basically hounded to death for being gay. And it was
just imagine what would happen if we let people be who they are. If we just let people be who.
Are we talking about Turing?
What?
Yeah, I'm talking about Turing, but I could go back and talk about Oscar Wilde if you want to, because there's another example of, somebody who was hounded to death, basically, because he was gay and because he wouldn't back down from it.
Right.
It was the father of the boy or the young man that he was having sex with that pursued him with such a vengeance. Devonshire, Duke of Devonshire, actually. And Oscar Wilde ended up paying the price for it. So there we go. Anyway, it's been wonderful to talk to you. So Patrick, thanks for your time. Let us remind you, we actually sold out, but we have reordered this marvelous book, In the Shadow of the Empress. And I'm telling you, if you read it, you will learn a great many things that you were not, probably never thought of. I certainly did. And I thought I knew a lot about all this. So there we
What's
are.
next for you, Nancy? Have you picked your next topic?
Not yet. I'm still getting over. This was 4 years of, and you can see how much research went into it because you had to go from different, and there was a lot of translation. I'm a very slow translator, so I'm kind of gearing up again to look.
Good for you.
But I'm sure I'll go into the next century. I'm dying to find out how everything played out into the next century.
So you're coming into the 19th century
Yeah.
for whatever it is you write. I
Yeah.
love the progression. I think that's wonderful. Right. If you live long enough, you could write about the 20th century. Yay. That'll be great.
I'm done. 20th century has been covered.
Right. Anyway, thank you so much.
Thank
for
you.
joining us
It was a
this
great,
evening.
thank you for having me.
It was really a pleasure. Good night, everybody. Thank
Bye.
you. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Hello. We hope you're enjoying our programs and podcasts with authors. We'd like to expand them, and your help would be appreciated. Please make a donation at poisonedpenfoundation.org. 100% of the proceeds will go to help connect authors with readers in this difficult time. Thank you.